The quiet advantage. How strategic thinkers observe more, react less, and win without making noise. Introduction. The war nobody sees. There is a war happening in every room you walk into. Not the kind with obvious sides, declared positions, or visible conflict. The kind that runs underneath every conversation, every negotiation, every moment of pressure, silent, structural, and almost entirely invisible to the people who are losing it. You have been in that war your entire life. You have won some of it. You have lost more of it than you realize. And the losses rarely came from the places you were watching. They didn't come from opponents who were smarter than you. They didn't come from situations that were genuinely impossible. They didn't come from lack of preparation or insufficient effort or bad luck distributed unfairly in your direction. They came from moments when you moved too soon. When you spoke before you understood the room. When you committed before the situation had fully revealed itself. When you reacted, quickly, automatically, in the completely human way that reaction always feels justified in the moment, and gave something away that took months or years to recover. You already know this. You have already felt the specific, quiet regret of I should have waited, of I said too much, of I let that get to me when I knew better, of standing in the aftermath of a moment you cannot take back, understanding with perfect clarity exactly where it went wrong, unable to explain why you didn't see it coming in time to choose differently. Those moments don't happen because you are incapable. They happen because no one ever taught you the system behind the instinct that was trying to protect you. This book is that system. Most people believe strategic thinking is about intelligence. That the person who thinks most clearly, argues most precisely, or moves most aggressively is the one who comes out ahead. That strategy is a sharp tool wielded by sharp people, a cognitive weapon for the quick-minded and the analytically gifted. That belief is wrong, and its wrongness is expensive. Because if you have lived long enough, and you have watched genuinely intelligent people destroy their own positions through emotional overreaction. You have seen capable, talented, well-prepared people hand away their leverage by speaking too much, moving too fast, or fighting battles that cost more to win than they were worth to begin with. You have witnessed intelligence, completely unregulated, produce outcomes that pure patience and restraint would have avoided entirely. Intelligence without self-governance is not strategy. It is capability without direction, a powerful engine with no steering. Real strategic thinking begins not when you deploy your intelligence. It begins when you govern it. When you pause long enough to observe what is actually happening beneath the surface of a situation before deciding whether and how to become part of it. That pause is the most undervalued skill available to a human being operating in a complex world. This book is built around developing it. What follows is not a manual for manipulation. It is not a collection of psychological tactics for controlling other people, winning arguments, or dominating rooms. It is something far more useful. It is a framework for controlling yourself, for developing the specific, trainable disciplines that allow you to stay clear-minded when everything around you is pushing you to react, to stay grounded when pressure is designed to unsteady you, to make decisions that still make sense days and months later instead of decisions that felt right in the moment and cost you afterward. 8 disciplines, each one building on the last, together forming the architecture of a mind that moves through the world with the particular, quiet confidence of someone who is never rushed because they understand that the person who controls themselves controls the tempo of every situation they enter. You do not need to become colder to think strategically. You do not need to become harder, more detached, or less human. You need to become more deliberate, more patient, more aware of the gap between what is happening and your automatic response to it, because inside that gap is where every strategic advantage lives. The war nobody sees is won there, quietly, consistently, without announcement. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Most people react. Strategic thinkers observe. Think about the last time a situation went wrong that didn't need to. Not a situation that was genuinely impossible, An obstacle too large or too fixed to have moved regardless of what you did. A situation that was actually manageable, that had a reasonable path through it. That another person, positioned the same way with the same resources, might have navigated without damage. Now trace it backward to the exact moment where it shifted from manageable to costly. In almost every case, that moment will be a reaction. A message sent while irritated. A position stated before the full picture was clear. A commitment made under pressure that removed options that would have been valuable later. A defense offered for something that hadn't actually been attacked yet. A response delivered at the speed of emotion rather than the speed of understanding. Reactions feel decisive. They feel honest. They feel like agency, like the appropriate, direct, self-respecting response to a world that is moving and demanding movement in return. What they actually are, in most cases, is information surrender. Every time you react automatically, you reveal your emotional state, your priorities, your pressure points, and your vulnerabilities to the exact people and situations that will use that information to determine how to handle you next. Reaction is not power. Reaction is exposure. And most people are exposing themselves continuously, in every conversation, in every moment of pressure, without ever recognizing that the information is leaving. Strategic thinkers operate from a fundamentally different starting position. Their first move, in almost every situation, is not to respond. It is to observe. Observation is not hesitation. This distinction is critical and must be established clearly before anything else in this chapter can land correctly. Hesitation is the paralysis of someone who doesn't know what to do and is waiting for the uncertainty to resolve. It comes from fear. It produces nothing while the situation moves without the person inside it. Observation is the active, deliberate, fully engaged discipline of staying present with a situation long enough to understand it before becoming part of it. It comes from confidence. It produces information, the only resource that consistently improves the quality of every decision made afterward. When a strategic thinker goes quiet in a room, they are not absent. They are working. They are watching how people speak, what they avoid, what pressures them, and what they reveal without intending to. They are reading tone, tracking inconsistency, noticing the gap between what is being said and what is being communicated beneath the words. While reactive people are busy responding to the surface of a situation, strategic thinkers are mapping its structure. And by the time they move, they are not guessing. They are choosing from a position of genuine understanding. That is not a small advantage. In complex situations, in high-stakes conversations, in moments where the wrong move produces damage that compounds for months, understanding the terrain before committing to a position is the difference between leverage and loss. Here is the specific mechanical reason why observation outperforms reaction in almost every situation of genuine consequence. Once you react, you have entered the game on someone else's terms. The moment you respond, emotionally, verbally, behaviorally, you have accepted the framing, the timing, and the terms of engagement as they were offered to you. You are now playing inside a structure you didn't design, on a timeline you didn't choose, from a position that was selected by someone else's opening move. Strategic thinkers refuse this by default, not through dramatic non-engagement, not through theatrical silence designed to signal depth, but through the quiet, practiced discipline of watching the situation unfold one moment longer than everyone else is comfortable with. That additional moment consistently reveals things that immediate reaction obscures. People explain themselves when given space to fill. They expose their actual intentions when no resistance pushes them into defensive positioning. They show whether a situation is genuinely urgent or merely performed as urgent to manufacture pressure. They demonstrate, through behavior in the absence of your reaction, far more about what they actually want than they would ever reveal in direct response to your questions. Silence has a way of applying pressure without effort. And that pressure, applied through deliberate non-reaction, produces information that is more reliable and more strategically useful than anything extracted through direct confrontation. The reactive mind and the observational mind ask fundamentally different questions in the same situation. The reactive mind asks, "How do I respond?" The observational mind asks, "What am I actually seeing?" That shift from response orientation to awareness orientation changes everything about how situations unfold. The person asking how to respond is already inside the situation emotionally. They are managing their own reaction while trying to formulate an answer, which means their cognitive capacity is split between understanding and performance simultaneously. The person asking what they are seeing is outside the situation long enough to observe it as a whole. They are not managing their response. They are collecting information, and the information they collect shapes a response, if one is needed at all, that is calibrated to the actual situation rather than to their emotional experience of it. Strategic thinkers also pay attention to elements that reactive thinkers never notice because they are too occupied with the immediate exchange to observe the broader pattern. Who speaks first in a negotiation? Who interrupts and who stays quiet? Where urgency comes from and what it is protecting. The specific words people use when they are comfortable versus the words they reach for when they are under pressure. The body language that contradicts the verbal message. The things not said that are more revealing than everything said. These details are always present. Most people never access them because observation requires a stillness that discomfort makes nearly impossible, and the untrained mind interprets social situations as inherently urgent, automatically generating the pressure to perform that forecloses the space required to observe. The practice that builds this capacity is called the pause before position rule. It is the simplest and most consistently effective habit in this entire book. Before you state your opinion, before you explain yourself, before you commit emotionally or verbally to a position in any conversation or situation of consequence, pause. Not dramatically, not as a performance of thoughtfulness. A genuine, internal pause in which 3 specific questions are asked quietly. What is actually happening here? What is being said versus what is being implied? What happens if I don't respond right now? The third question is the most important and the most underused. Most situations feel urgent because emotion is involved. Emotion generates urgency the way a fever generates heat, automatically, physiologically, without reference to whether the urgency is warranted by the actual stakes of the moment. Strategic thinkers have learned to separate urgency from importance. They understand that the loudest moment in a situation is almost never the most significant one, that the pressure to respond immediately is usually manufactured by other people's discomfort with silence, by social expectations about the appropriate tempo of exchange, by the ego's insistence that letting a moment pass without response represents some form of defeat. It doesn't. The person who speaks last often controls the direction of the entire conversation. They decide which exchanges deserve engagement. They decide what information stays private. They decide when the situation has revealed enough for a response to be worth making. That control, quiet, invisible, produced entirely through the discipline of observation, is the first advantage available in any situation. Observation also changes your relationship with your own reactions over time. As the habit develops, you begin to notice your automatic responses before they escape. The irritation that was about to become a statement, the defense that was about to be offered for a position nobody had challenged, the correction that was about to prioritize being right over the more important question of what the moment actually required. That noticing is not suppression. You are not preventing yourself from feeling. You are creating the space between feeling and action that Chapter 2 will identify as the structural foundation of everything that follows in this book. For now, the single most important operational truth from this chapter. The first advantage in any situation is information. Information comes to those who observe before they move. When you react first, you surrender that advantage permanently. When you observe first, you accumulate it, quietly, consistently, without announcing it. And in a world full of people who are reacting automatically to everything, The person who is watching instead holds a form of clarity that is almost impossible for reactive thinkers to compete with. Not because they are more intelligent, because they are more still. In the next chapter, you'll learn why emotional control is not a personality trait some people are born with and others aren't. It is the trained, practiced, repeatedly built discipline that determines whether everything else in this book is accessible to you. Without emotional regulation, observation is impossible. Without observation, strategy is impossible. The foundation comes first, and the foundation is always self-governance. Chapter 2. Emotional control is the foundation of strategy. You have made decisions you regret that you would never make again. Not because you lacked information, not because the situation was genuinely beyond your capacity to navigate, but because you made them while your emotions were loud, while anger had narrowed your vision, while pride had hijacked your judgment, while the need to relieve internal pressure had overridden every longer-term consideration that would have produced a better outcome. Every person reading this has that catalog, the message sent in a moment of frustration that permanently altered a relationship, the commitment made under excitement that looked completely different 3 weeks later when the emotion had cleared, the confrontation initiated from wounded pride that cost far more to finish than it was worth to start, the words spoken at exactly the wrong moment that cannot be retrieved regardless of how much was offered in apology afterward. These are not failures of intelligence. They are failures of regulation. And they are the most expensive category of mistake available because, unlike strategic errors, miscalculations about information, timing, or positioning, emotional mistakes are often irreversible. The situation can be correct. The leverage can be rebuilt. But words spoken cannot be unspoken, and impressions formed in moments of emotional exposure do not simply disappear because the emotion has since passed. Emotional control is not a personality trait distributed unevenly at birth. It is a trainable discipline, and it is the prerequisite for every other skill this book will develop, because without it, observation collapses under pressure, situational reading becomes contaminated by personal feeling, silence becomes impossible to sustain, and long-term thinking gets overridden by the immediate demand of emotional relief. Everything else in this book depends on this chapter. Begin with a distinction that most people miss entirely because it sounds simple and operates at a level of complexity that most self-improvement frameworks never fully address. Emotion is not the problem. Emotion is data. Among the most reliable, most immediately available data a human being has access to, because it is generated by the nervous system's continuous, unconscious processing of environmental signals that the conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. Anger tells you a boundary has been crossed, or that you believe one has. Fear signals perceived threat, to safety, to resources, to status, to something you value enough that its potential loss produces a physical response. Excitement points toward alignment, towards something that matches a direction or desire your system recognizes as significant. Discomfort flags inconsistency between what is happening and what you expected or needed. These signals are not enemies. They are instruments. A navigator who ignores all instrumentation because some of the readings are uncomfortable is not sailing more freely. They are sailing blind. The problem appears at a specific moment in the sequence, the moment emotion stops functioning as information and starts functioning as command. When feelings dictate action rather than inform it, the quality of decision-making degrades in a consistent, predictable, well-documented direction. Decisions become short-sighted because the emotional state creates tunnel vision, narrowing perception to the immediate and the visceral at the expense of the broader and the consequential. Words are spoken with force that the situation didn't require and the relationship cannot absorb. Promises are made quickly to relieve internal pressure without regard for their downstream cost. Conflicts that could have been managed with patience and timing instead escalate because someone needed the feeling to stop more than they needed the situation to improve. Strategic thinkers draw one precise line here. They allow themselves to feel everything. They refuse to be ruled by what they feel. There are three distinct internal processes that most people collapse into a single, undifferentiated reaction. The first is feeling, the raw emotional signal generated below conscious awareness, arriving as a physical and psychological state. The second is interpretation, the story the conscious mind tells about that emotional state. Not the emotion itself, but the meaning assigned to it. This means I am being disrespected. This means the situation is out of control. This means I need to act now or lose something I cannot afford to lose. The third is action, the behavior that follows the interpretation. In the reactive mind, these three steps happen so rapidly and so seamlessly that they feel like one thing. The feeling arrives, and the action follows with almost no interval between them. The interpretation, the story connecting emotion to behavior, is constructed so automatically and so quickly that it never surfaces for examination. This is the operational vulnerability that emotional reactivity creates. Not the feeling, the story. Because the story is almost always incomplete, frequently inaccurate, and consistently biased toward the emotional state that generated it. Anger produces stories about injustice. Fear produces stories about threat. Wounded pride produces stories about attack. And actions taken from those stories, before the stories have been tested, questioned, or allowed to modify as the situation reveals more information, produce results that serve the emotion rather than the outcome. Strategic thinkers slow this sequence deliberately. They feel without immediately interpreting. They hold the emotion long enough to question the story before accepting it. They separate the raw signal from the narrative constructed around it and ask whether the narrative is accurate or whether it is the emotion's attempt to justify immediate action. That separation, practiced, trained, built through repeated application, is where strategic decision-making actually lives. Here is one of the least obvious and most practically useful advantages of emotional regulation. Calm, under pressure, is perceived as authority. Not because people consciously reason through the connection, because the perception is automatic and near universal. The nervous system of anyone watching a composed person in a high-pressure situation registers that composure as knowledge, as competence, as the specific confidence of someone who understands more than they are revealing. When you remain regulated while others escalate, people listen more carefully to what you say. They share more information, partly because your stillness creates safety and partly because they are unconsciously trying to understand why you aren't alarmed when they are. They project depth onto your composure. They assume that the absence of visible reaction reflects the presence of invisible understanding. This effect operates entirely without effort or performance. You do not need to announce your calm. You do not need to signal it. Simply being it, genuinely, not as a performance over suppressed panic, produces a shift in how others calibrate their behavior toward you. Strategic thinkers understand this as influence without leverage. You are not doing anything to the other person. You are simply occupying a frequency that their nervous system reads as high status and responds to accordingly. The inverse is equally instructive. Emotional reactivity, for the same automatic reasons, is read as vulnerability, as exposure. When you react visibly to a provocation, you confirm that the provocation found its target. You demonstrate that you can be moved, which means you can be directed. Every reactive moment is a map that other people, consciously or not, use to navigate how to handle you in future situations. Strategic thinkers are careful about what maps they hand out. Emotional control also functions as protection against a specific and widely used form of manipulation that most people experience without ever naming it. Pressure applied to emotion is perhaps the most common and most effective method of steering someone's decisions without appearing to steer them. A comment designed to provoke defensiveness. Silence maintained past the point of comfort to create urgency. A deadline presented as fixed when it has flexibility, calibrated precisely to trigger the fear of loss that forces premature commitment. The display of disappointment from someone whose opinion matters, time to arrive exactly when you are about to make a decision that doesn't serve their interests. None of these require the person deploying them to be consciously manipulative. Many are completely automatic. People learn what produces results and repeat it without ever analyzing the mechanism. What they share is a single operational logic. If emotional state can be influenced, behavior can be directed. Strategic thinkers neutralize this by noticing the pressure before responding to it. When urgency appears, they ask what the urgency is protecting. When silence is applied as a tool, they recognize it as a tool rather than experiencing it as a vacuum that demands filling. When disappointment is deployed as leverage, they separate the relationship from the decision and evaluate each on its own terms. The question is always the same. What is this pressure trying to force, and does that direction serve my actual interests? That question is only accessible from a regulated state. From inside an emotional reaction, the pressure simply feels like reality, like the natural weight of a situation that genuinely requires immediate response. The distance required to see it as a constructed environment is exactly the distance that emotional control provides. One practical rule governs this entire chapter and deserves to be stated plainly. Never decide at the peak of emotion. Not a rule about which emotions are acceptable. Not a hierarchy of emotional states ranked by their reliability as decision-making environments. One rule, applied universally, without exception. At peak emotional intensity, whether the emotion is anger, fear, grief, excitement, or the wounded certainty of someone who has just been publicly disrespected, the quality of judgment is at its lowest. Not because emotion corrupts the thinking process, because peak emotion signals that the interpretation stage of the three-step sequence is running at maximum bias. The story is as loaded as it will ever be. The evidence filter is at maximum selectivity. The narrative connecting feeling to action is at its most internally consistent and most externally unreliable. Waiting, even briefly, allows the intensity to drop without the emotion disappearing. The information the emotion was carrying remains accessible. The story becomes examinable. The action that emerges is chosen rather than compelled. What feels urgent in the moment loses importance with time in the overwhelming majority of cases. Strategic thinkers have experienced this enough to trust it. The situation that felt like it demanded an immediate response at 11 p.m. looks different in the morning. The message that needed to be sent before the night was over rarely needed to be sent at all. This applies with equal force to positive emotional peaks. Excitement is as reliable a distortion field as anger. It produces overcommitment, premature action, and the particular blindness of someone who has already decided and is now selectively processing information to confirm the decision. Strategic thinkers temper enthusiasm with evaluation. They ask whether an opportunity genuinely aligns with long-term direction or whether it merely feels like alignment, because the emotion is temporarily making everything look compatible. The delay is not indecision. It is the discipline of ensuring that the action that follows is chosen by the person, not produced by the feeling. Emotional energy is finite. This is the element of emotional control that most people understand least and pay for most expensively. Every emotional reaction, every escalation, every defensive response, every argument engaged unnecessarily, every provocation taken personally, consumes a portion of the finite daily supply of focused attention and decision-making capacity. A mind that has spent significant emotional energy on minor conflicts, small provocations, and situations that didn't warrant full engagement arrives at genuinely important decisions depleted. The quality of judgment at that point is not the quality available at full capacity. And the decisions made from depletion, the late-day commitments, the end-of-rope responses, the choices made when the regulatory capacity is exhausted, are consistently the ones that require the most recovery. Strategic thinkers treat emotional energy as a resource to be allocated deliberately, not as an unlimited supply to be drawn from as situations demand. They reserve their strongest responses for moments that genuinely warrant them. They decline engagement with minor provocations not because they lack the capacity to respond, but because the response costs more than the exchange is worth. This is not passivity. It is the intelligent management of a resource with a daily limit. The goal is not to eliminate emotion from decision-making. That would produce a different kind of dysfunction, the cold, unresponsive processing of a system that has lost access to the most immediate and most reliable information it has. The goal is to lead emotion rather than be led by it, to feel fully, with complete access to every signal the nervous system generates, while retaining the authority to decide what action follows. To use emotion as the instrument it is designed to be rather than allowing it to replace the judgment it is designed to inform. When that regulation is genuinely established, not performed, not suppressed, but actually built through practice, something specific changes in how you move through the world. You stop being pushed by circumstances and start positioning yourself within them. Not because the circumstances have changed, because you have changed in relation to them. That change is the foundation. Everything built on it is strategy. In the next chapter, you'll develop the third layer of the strategic architecture, the ability to read the actual structure of a situation before committing to a position within it. Observation gives you information. Emotional control gives you access to that information without distortion. Situational reading is what you do with both, the practical skill of mapping power, pressure, and pace before you move, so that when you do move, the action fits the terrain rather than fighting it. Chapter 3. Read the terrain before you move. A good move made in the wrong situation is still a mistake. This is the principle most people never fully absorb, because it runs directly against the way most people are taught to think about preparation, capability, and effort. The conventional model says, develop the right skill, formulate the right approach, execute with sufficient commitment, and the result will follow. Master the move. Apply the move. Win. That model works in controlled environments, laboratories, practice fields, situations where the variables are known, fixed, and identical to the ones you prepared for. It fails in the real world because the real world is not a controlled environment. It is a living terrain, shifting constantly, shaped by the specific people present, the specific pressures operating on them, the specific history behind the current moment, and dozens of other factors that have nothing to do with the quality of your preparation and everything to do with whether the conditions are aligned for your action to land the way you intend. Strategic thinkers understand this deeply. Before they speak or act, before they deploy anything they know or have prepared, they pause to ask one essential question. What is really happening here? Not what appears to be happening, not what the surface of the situation suggests. What is actually operating beneath the visible exchange, the real structure of incentives, pressures, needs, and power dynamics that will determine whether any action succeeds or fails regardless of how well executed it is. That question, asked genuinely, before commitment, is the beginning of situational intelligence. Every situation has layers. There is what people say and there is what they mean. There is what is visible and there is what is driving behavior beneath the surface. There is the presented reality, the words, the stated positions, the explicit content of the exchange, and there is the actual reality, shaped by power dynamics, emotional pressure, unspoken incentives, fear, urgency, and ego operating mostly below the level of conscious acknowledgement. Reactive thinkers respond to the surface layer. They take the presented reality at face value, formulate a response to what was said, and execute on that response with the confidence of someone who believes they are engaging the real situation. Strategic thinkers read what drives the surface. They understand that the presented reality is always a partial representation of the actual one, that what people say is shaped by what they want, what they fear, what they are protecting, and what they believe you want to hear, that the stated position and the real position are frequently different things, and that acting on the stated position without understanding the real one produces responses that look calibrated but are functionally misdirected. Reading the actual situation beneath the presented one is the skill this chapter is built around. And like every skill in this book, it is trainable, not through cleverness, through the consistent, practiced application of a specific observational framework. 3 elements reveal the structure of almost any situation if you know where to look. Power, pressure, pace. Power is who influences outcomes, not necessarily the person with the highest title, the loudest voice, or the most explicit authority. Real power in a given moment belongs to whoever has the most options, whoever can walk away from the current situation without catastrophic consequence. The person with alternatives holds leverage over the person with urgency. The person who can afford to wait holds leverage over the person who needs resolution now. Power is rarely announced. It is demonstrated through behavior, through the ease with which someone tolerates uncertainty, the absence of defensiveness when challenged, the willingness to let silence extend without rushing to fill it. Strategic thinkers read these signals continuously, mapping the real distribution of leverage before deciding how to position themselves within it. Pressure is who feels constrained. Urgency reveals vulnerability. When someone is pushing for quick resolution, accelerating timelines, expressing impatience, reframing delays as problems, they are almost always signaling that delay costs them more than it costs you. The source of that pressure is information. It tells you what they need, what they fear losing, and therefore where the leverage actually sits regardless of how the formal structure of the situation appears. Strategic thinkers do not mirror urgency. They let it surface. They allow the pressure to exist without relieving it prematurely, because the pressure, sustained, clarifies the situation in ways that immediate accommodation would prevent. Pace is who is driving the tempo of events. Situations move at the speed of their most impatient participant unless someone deliberately decelerates. Most people allow pace to be set for them. They follow the rhythm established by whoever is most eager for movement. Strategic thinkers notice pace as a variable that can be managed. They understand that slowing the tempo of an exchange almost always works in favor of the party with more patience and against the party with more urgency. Together, power, pressure, pace. These 3 elements provide a structural snapshot of any situation that makes the appropriate response far clearer than any analysis of the surface content alone. One of the most common and most costly errors in situational reading is the assumption that logic determines outcomes. Most capable people carry this assumption without examining it. They believe that if their position is correct, if their argument is sound, if their case is well-constructed and well-delivered, the situation will bend in their favor. That accuracy and merit are sufficient conditions for success. They are not. Truth without timing creates resistance. Accuracy without awareness creates conflict. A correct position delivered into a defensive, emotional environment produces entrenchment, not agreement. A sound argument presented before the other party feels heard produces dismissal, not persuasion. A fair proposal offered to someone whose ego is engaged produces counterpositioning, not acceptance. The rightness of the content is only one variable. The conditions into which the content is delivered determine whether it lands. Strategic thinkers respect context as much as correctness. They understand that the same words, delivered at different moments, in different emotional environments, with different awareness of the power dynamics operating in the room, produce completely different outcomes. This is why reading the situation always precedes the move. Not because the content doesn't matter, because the content, no matter how strong, is filtered through the conditions before it reaches its destination. And a thorough understanding of the conditions allows you to choose the timing, framing, and delivery that gives the content the best possible environment to be received. Emotional temperature is the most immediately accessible layer of situational reading, and the one most consistently ignored by people who are focused on what they want to say rather than what the moment can receive. Is the environment tense or open, defensive or receptive? Is the person across from you fully present or partially elsewhere, managing something internal that has nothing to do with the current exchange? When emotional intensity is high, logic rarely lands. Not because the other person is irrational, but because a nervous system operating under emotional load processes incoming information differently, more defensively, more selectively, more oriented toward threat assessment than toward genuine engagement with new ideas. Strategic thinkers wait for emotional temperature to drop before introducing clarity. They understand that a genuinely good idea presented into a charged environment will be evaluated through the filter of that charge, that the emotional state of the listener shapes what the idea becomes in their processing of it. Patience, here, is not delay. It is the recognition that the same words land differently depending on when they are delivered, and that choosing the right moment is not a compromise of the message but an investment in its actual reception. This also means that sometimes the most strategic action is no action. Not every problem requires intervention. Not every silence needs to be filled. Not every conflict requires a resolution that you initiate. People often resolve their own conflicts when given space. Situations that appear to demand immediate engagement frequently resolve, clarify, or reframe themselves if allowed to develop without interference. Acting too early entangles you in outcomes that were never yours to manage. Committing your position, your energy, and your reputation to a situation that would have resolved without your participation. Strategic thinkers are comfortable allowing events to unfold. They do not confuse watching with losing. They understand that restraint in the face of apparent urgency is frequently the most powerful form of engagement available. Situational awareness also prevents a specific category of error that compounds quietly over time. Misinterpretation. When you fail to read context, when you respond to the surface of a situation without understanding its structure, you personalize behavior that has nothing to do with you. The colleague who is short in a meeting is processing a crisis you don't know about. The client who delays a response is managing competing priorities invisible to you. The partner who pushes back on a proposal is protecting something unstated that has nothing to do with the quality of the proposal itself. Reactive thinkers experience these as personal signals, as indicators of how they are regarded, what the other person thinks of them, whether the relationship is in good standing. They respond emotionally to data that isn't about them, generating conflict and misunderstanding from situations that were simply contextually complex. Strategic thinkers separate personal feelings from environmental factors. They ask, before interpreting any behavior as personal, whether there is a structural or situational explanation that accounts for it without requiring a negative conclusion about the relationship. This habit, simple in description, demanding in practice, eliminates an enormous amount of unnecessary conflict and protects emotional energy for situations that genuinely require it. Reading situations improves with practice in a specific and observable way. Initially, it is deliberate, a conscious application of the power-pressure-pace framework, a conscious pause to assess emotional temperature, a conscious effort to separate surface content from underlying structure. It requires attention and intention and produces results that feel earned. Over time, it becomes intuitive. You begin to sense shifts before they are visible. You notice when the energy in a room changes before anyone has done or said anything overt. You feel when a conversation is about to turn, when the tone shifts from exploratory to defensive, when the other person has made a decision they haven't announced yet, when the situation has become something different from what it appeared to be 5 minutes ago. This is not mystical. It is the accumulated result of repeated observation producing pattern recognition that operates faster than conscious analysis. The same process through which any expert develops the intuition that looks, from outside, like a talent they were born with. You were not born reading rooms. You read rooms poorly, and then better, and then well. The progression is available to anyone willing to pay attention long enough for the patterns to become familiar. Strategy is not constant movement. It is precise movement. And precision, the kind that produces results with the efficiency of someone who rarely needs to redo what they have already done, begins with understanding where you stand, who you are dealing with, and what the moment actually requires before committing to a direction. When you read situations before making moves, you stop guessing. You stop applying well-developed skills to poorly understood environments and wondering why the results don't match the quality of the effort. You stop wasting the most limited resource you have, your focused attention and your decisive energy, on moves that looked right from where you were standing because you hadn't yet understood the full structure of where you actually stood. You start choosing moves that fit the terrain. And moves that fit the terrain require far less force than moves that fight it. That efficiency, the quiet, almost invisible efficiency of someone who consistently acts from genuine understanding rather than informed assumption, is what strategic advantage looks like from the inside. From the outside, it looks like exceptional judgment. The difference is that judgment can be developed. Reading the terrain is how. In the next chapter, you'll learn why the amount you speak is one of the most powerful strategic variables available to you, not as a technique, not as a performance, but as the natural expression of someone who has enough clarity about what they know and what they need to say nothing until words genuinely serve the situation. Strategic thinkers don't dominate conversations. They shape them. And often the most influential move available is not what you say, but what you deliberately choose not to say at all. Chapter 4. Speak less. Mean more. Most people believe influence comes from saying the right things. Strategic thinkers understand something that takes longer to learn and produces far better results. Influence comes from saying fewer things. The right things at the right moment, after the discipline of silence has already done most of the work. This is not a comfortable idea. It runs directly against the cultural pressure to be articulate, present, vocal, and continuously engaged, to demonstrate competence through the fluency of your speech, to signal intelligence through the volume and speed of your contribution, to maintain relevance in any exchange by being consistently heard within it. That pressure is real. It is also strategically expensive. Because every word you speak is information leaving your operating system. Every sentence reveals something: your emotional state, your priorities, your certainty, your doubts, your agenda. The more you speak, the more complete the map becomes that other people are holding of how you think, what matters to you, where your pressure points are, and how you can be directed. Reactive thinkers speak to relieve tension, to assert identity, to fill silence that their nervous system reads as threatening, to demonstrate that they are present, engaged, and not to be overlooked. Strategic thinkers speak when words serve a specific purpose, not to perform presence, not to manage discomfort, not to establish that they exist in the room. To be effective, precisely that and nothing more. The discomfort of silence is the key to understanding why most people speak too much. Silence, in social environments, creates a specific kind of pressure. It generates uncertainty about what is being thought, what is being judged, whether the absence of speech represents disapproval, confusion, or something worse. Most people experience that uncertainty as inherently threatening and respond to it the way they respond to most threats, by eliminating it as quickly as possible. Words eliminate silence. So words are produced, not because they add clarity to the situation, not because they move things in a useful direction, but because they end the discomfort. Because the internal pressure of sustained silence exceeds the strategic cost of speaking, and the nervous system resolves the tension the only way it immediately knows how. Strategic thinkers have developed a different relationship with that discomfort. They have learned, through practice, through exposure, through the repeated experience of allowing silence to exist and watching what it produces, that the discomfort is not a signal to act. It is a signal that the silence is working. Because silence, in a social environment, does something that words rarely can. It applies pressure without effort. When you don't react immediately, when you allow a statement to sit, a question to hang, a provocation to exist in the room without immediately addressing it, the person who created the silence is now responsible for filling it. And in filling it, they almost always reveal more than they intended. They explain themselves without being asked. They justify positions that weren't challenged. They restate offers in ways that improve them to fill the gap your silence created. They expose the level of urgency they are operating with, the flexibility in their position, the degree to which they need the exchange to resolve in a particular direction. Silence, sustained with genuine composure, is among the most effective information-gathering tools available. It costs nothing. It requires no preparation. It reveals the actual structure of the situation far more reliably than direct questioning, which puts people on guard and produces defended answers. The only requirement is the willingness to sit with the discomfort long enough for the silence to do its work. Every word you speak does three things simultaneously. It communicates content, the explicit information or position you are conveying. It reveals state, the emotional, psychological, and strategic position you are currently occupying. It creates expectations about how you will continue to behave, what you are committed to, and what can be anticipated from you in future exchanges. Most people are aware of the first function and almost entirely unaware of the second and third. They evaluate what they say by the content it carries and miss entirely what it reveals about their state and what expectations it generates. Strategic thinkers evaluate all three functions before speaking. Does this content serve the situation? Is what I am about to say actually useful, or am I producing words to manage my own internal state? What does this reveal about where I currently am? Am I about to show uncertainty, urgency, defensiveness, or need that gives the other party information about my position that weakens my leverage? What does this commit me to? Once spoken, these words will create expectations. Are those expectations I want to be held to? Do they close options I may need later? That three-part evaluation, applied even briefly before speaking, changes the character of everything you say, not by making you cold or withholding, but by making your words deliberate rather than habitual, by ensuring that when you speak, the decision to speak was made, not produced automatically by social pressure or emotional discomfort. There is a specific and powerful secondary effect of restraint that most people never anticipate. When you speak less, the words you do use carry disproportionate weight. People calibrate attention based on signal frequency. In an environment where everyone speaks constantly, all speech begins to sound like background, a continuous stream of words that the brain learns to process at reduced attention because the density of input makes full engagement unsustainable. The person who speaks rarely introduces a different dynamic. When they do speak, the frequency shift registers. Attention sharpens. People listen more carefully because the behavioral pattern has established that words from this source are selected rather than automatic, that they carry a higher probability of being worth attending to. This effect is not manufactured through performance. It emerges naturally from the genuine practice of restraint. You are not signaling depth. You are producing it. And the attention that follows is not a response to a technique. It is a response to a real pattern. Strategic thinkers also understand the specific protection that restraint provides against premature commitment. Words create expectations. Once spoken, they are extraordinarily difficult to retract without cost. A position stated publicly is harder to revise than a position held privately. A commitment made in words is a standard you will be measured against. An opinion expressed is an identity marker that others will use to categorize and predict your future behavior. Keeping options open, maintaining flexibility in a situation that is still developing, preserving the ability to move in directions that haven't yet fully revealed themselves, requires limiting verbal commitments until the situation has clarified enough to know which commitments are worth making. The reactive thinker states their position early and defends it. The strategic thinker waits until they understand enough to know whether the position is worth defending. Restraint in communication also transforms the quality of listening. Most people listen while simultaneously constructing their next response. The attention that appears to be directed outward, toward what the other person is saying, is actually split, partially receiving the incoming information, partially processing how to answer it, which means that a significant portion of what is actually being said is missed because the cognitive capacity that would register it is occupied with preparation. Strategic thinkers listen to understand, not to prepare a response, not to find the point of entry for their own contribution, but to actually receive and process what is being communicated, including what is being communicated beneath the words. What is emphasized repeatedly? What is avoided despite being relevant? What is phrased carefully in ways that suggest it matters more than the casualness of the delivery implies? What is expressed with emotion that exceeds what the surface content would warrant, signaling that the real issue is something adjacent to what is being stated directly? These signals are present in almost every significant conversation. They are available to anyone who has enough attentional capacity to receive them. And that capacity requires the discipline of genuinely listening rather than occupying the listening space with preparation for speech. When strategic thinkers do speak, the character of what they produce is qualitatively different from the output of someone who speaks habitually. They don't ramble, not because they lack ideas, but because they have already filtered the ideas for the ones that serve the situation. They don't over-explain, not because they distrust the other person's intelligence, but because explanation beyond what the moment requires is usually a performance of competence rather than an expression of it. They don't decorate their point, not because they lack facility with language, but because ornamentation adds length without adding precision. They aim for clarity. One clear sentence that says exactly what needs to be said carries more weight and leaves a more durable impression than 3 minutes of elaboration that dilutes the core point with qualifications and additions that the nervous system, sensing incompleteness, keeps generating. Precision signals confidence. It communicates that the speaker knows what they are saying, that the words arrive through selection, not through the kind of continuous production that stops only when it runs out of material. That signal, the specific authority that precision carries, is not a technique that can be performed over incomplete thinking. It requires actually knowing what you want to say before you say it, which requires the pause, which requires the discipline of silence applied long enough for clarity to precede speech. There is one final dimension of this chapter that belongs here because it reframes the entire practice from a different angle. Silence protects relationships. The words most damaging to relationships are rarely the ones chosen deliberately. They are the ones produced automatically, under frustration, under pressure, in the moment when emotion is highest and the filter between feeling and expression is at its most permeable. The message sent at 11 p.m. The correction made in public when it could have been made privately. The honest opinion delivered at the wrong moment by someone who valued accuracy over timing. The sharp response that felt completely justified in the moment and produced consequences that were not. Every one of these is a failure of the pause, a moment where the word traveled faster than the judgment that would have modified or withheld it. Strategic thinkers understand that the most valuable thing restraint protects is not leverage or position or strategic advantage. It is the relationships within which everything else operates. Because no strategic position survives the sustained erosion of trust that impulsive speech, repeated over time, inevitably produces. Speak less, mean more. Not as a technique deployed selectively when stakes are visible, as the permanent, practiced default mode of someone who has developed genuine respect for the weight of words, who understands that language is not just expression, it is architecture, that what you build with it, and what you leave unbuilt, shapes the entire environment in which you operate. When your words are selected rather than habitual, something changes in how every room you enter relates to you. Not because you have performed a strategy, because you have become someone different. Someone who, in a world drowning in noise, carries the particular authority of a person who only speaks when it matters. In the next chapter, you'll confront the most expensive thinking pattern in modern life, the systematic preference for short-term relief over long-term position. Most people quietly sabotage their futures by winning present moments. Strategic thinkers make a different trade. They tolerate immediate discomfort to protect outcomes that accumulate over time. The compounding logic of long-term thinking, and why consistency always outperforms intensity, is the subject of Chapter 5. Chapter 5, think long win longer. Most people are trained, almost without realizing it, to optimize for now. Not through laziness, not through lack of ambition or absence of genuine desire for a different future, through something more structural, a cognitive and emotional architecture that generates immediate discomfort from delay and immediate relief from action, regardless of whether the action serves the direction or merely silences the pressure to move. The nervous system that generates this architecture was not designed for strategic thinking. It was designed for survival, for the immediate threat, the present hunger, the current danger. It is exquisitely calibrated to respond to what is happening now and genuinely indifferent to what will happen in 6 months as a result of what is decided today. This is not a character flaw. It is a design feature operating in the wrong environment. Because the challenges that determine the quality of a modern human life are almost never immediate. They are cumulative. They compound, slowly, invisibly, in the direction established by 1,000 small decisions that felt minor in the moment and turned out to be foundational in aggregate. Short-term thinking doesn't feel like a strategy. It feels like reality, like the appropriate, sensible, grounded response to the actual pressures of the actual present moment. That is exactly what makes it so expensive. It never announces itself as a choice. It simply executes as the default. Strategic thinkers make a different choice. Deliberately, repeatedly, against the consistent pressure of a nervous system that is trying to optimize for right now at the expense of everything that comes after. Short-term thinking is driven by emotion. The need for relief. The demand for fairness right now. The requirement that discomfort end before it has produced what it was sent to produce. The ego's insistence that it be acknowledged, respected, and validated in this exchange rather than in the longer arc of results that will eventually make the argument unnecessary. Long-term thinking is driven by direction. Not by what the moment feels like, but by where the decision leads. Not by what would resolve the current pressure, but by what the current pressure, sustained, not relieved prematurely, will eventually clarify or strengthen. This difference becomes most visible under conflict. Reactive thinkers want resolution immediately. They want the tension gone. They want to feel right and be acknowledged as right and move through the discomfort of the disagreement to the other side of it as quickly as possible. And so they push for quick resolution, for immediate acknowledgement, for the satisfaction of winning the exchange, without regard for what the exchange costs in leverage, in relationship, or in the impression it leaves on everyone present. Strategic thinkers care less about winning the argument. They care about preserving position. They understand that some conflicts don't need to be resolved right now. That time, allowed to operate without interference, frequently changes the conditions of a disagreement in ways that engagement would prevent. That the person who needs to win the argument today is demonstrating something about themselves that will shape how this exchange is navigated in every future instance. The willingness to lose the present moment deliberately, to allow a misunderstanding to stand, to decline the defense of a position that doesn't need defending, to let someone else have the satisfaction of the final word in an exchange that doesn't matter, is not weakness. It is the long game. There is a specific category of short-term thinking that produces damage quietly and expensively over time, and it deserves its own examination. The need to prove yourself. Most people carry some version of this need. The requirement that competence be visible, that effort be recognized, that ability be confirmed by external acknowledgement. It is the need that makes people explain when they weren't asked to, defend when they weren't challenged, and perform capability in situations where simply being capable without announcing it would have served them better. That need almost always comes from insecurity, from an internal measurement system that is running on external inputs, that requires continuous validation to maintain its current reading, that experiences the absence of acknowledgement as a threat to the sense of standing. Strategic thinkers are not free of this need. They have simply developed enough clarity about the cost of acting from it to resist it most of the time. They are comfortable being misunderstood temporarily if protecting future outcomes requires it. They can watch someone form an incorrect impression of them without immediately correcting it, because they understand that results, consistent, accumulated, undeniable over time, create a more durable form of credibility than any explanation they could offer in the present moment. They trust that time will clarify what defensiveness would only complicate. This is not passivity. It is the specific confidence of someone who is playing a longer game than the person in front of them, who doesn't need to win the current moment because they are building towards something that the current moment cannot reach. Compounding is the mechanism that makes long-term thinking worth the discomfort it requires. Most people understand this principle intellectually, applied to money, that consistent small contributions, accumulated over time with returns reinvested, produce outcomes that dwarf what the individual contributions would suggest, that the curve is not linear but exponential, that patience is not passive waiting but active construction, each day adding to a structure that becomes disproportionately powerful with time. Strategic thinkers apply this logic to everything. To skills developed consistently over years rather than learned intensively and abandoned when motivation fades. To relationships maintained with patience and genuine investment rather than activated when immediately useful and neglected otherwise. To habits that seem minor in any single execution and turn out to be definitional in aggregate. The daily practice that produces the capacity the single intensive effort never reaches. To reputation, built through consistent behavior across dozens of unremarkable interactions, each one leaving a trace in how others assess reliability, character, and trustworthiness. Consistency outperforms intensity, not in any single moment. Intensity wins in a single moment every time. Over time, the person who shows up consistently, who maintains direction without requiring motivation spikes, who produces at 80% capacity every day rather than 120% capacity twice a month, that person builds something that intensity cannot. Short-term thinkers measure success by visible progress, by feedback that confirms movement, by the external signal that things are going in the right direction. Strategic thinkers measure success by trajectory, by whether the current direction, sustained, leads where they actually want to go, by whether the decisions being made today are building or eroding the position they are trying to reach. Quiet progress, invisible in any given week, unmistakable over years, is the signature of long-term thinking applied consistently. Pressure reveals the difference between these two mindsets with complete clarity. When stress rises and situations become demanding, short-term thinkers look for exits. They compromise earlier than the situation requires because continued tension is intolerable. They trade leverage for comfort, accepting terms that underserve them in exchange for the emotional relief of resolution. They interpret their discomfort as a signal that the position is unsustainable, when the actual signal is simply that the nervous system is doing what it always does under pressure, generating urgency to produce movement. Strategic thinkers hold position longer, not through stubbornness, through the developed understanding that pressure is frequently manufactured, that the urgency pushing them toward premature resolution is often the other party's strategy rather than the situation's actual requirement, and that the position usually improves for the party willing to sustain it past the point of discomfort. They tolerate uncertainty without needing it resolved prematurely. They allow situations to develop to the point where the actual conditions are clear before committing to a direction. They trust their principles and their process over their current emotional read of the situation, because they have experienced enough times that the emotional read at peak pressure is reliably the least accurate read available. This tolerance of uncertainty, of pressure, of the discomfort of not knowing how things will resolve, is not a talent. It is a trained capacity, built through repeated experience of staying in difficult positions long enough to discover that they resolve better through patience than through action, and that the resolution produced by waiting is almost always of higher quality than the resolution produced by the need for the discomfort to stop. Long-term thinking also changes the relationship with opportunities. Short-term thinkers experience opportunity as scarcity, as a limited supply of openings that must be seized immediately or lost permanently. This scarcity framing produces overcommitment, the acceptance of terms that don't genuinely serve the direction, and the scattering of energy across multiple simultaneous pursuits that each receive less than they require to produce real results. Strategic thinkers experience opportunity as abundant but selective. Not every opening deserves attention. Not every invitation leads somewhere worth going. Not every project that looks interesting in the present aligns with the direction being built over time. The question they ask about every opportunity is not, "Can I do this?" which is almost always yes, but does this compound what I am building? That question eliminates an enormous amount of appealing but misdirected activity. It concentrates energy on the small number of investments that actually strengthen the long-term position rather than simply adding to the short-term load. Strategic thinkers do fewer things, better, for longer. And the outcomes produced by that depth of focus, by the resources concentrated on the directions that genuinely compound, are categorically different from the outcomes produced by the broad, reactive, scarcity-driven engagement with every opportunity that presents itself. Setbacks, in the framework of long-term thinking, lose the power they hold over short-term thinkers. Short-term thinkers experience setbacks as failures, as evidence that the direction is wrong, that the capacity is insufficient, that the effort invested was wasted. The emotional response to a significant setback in a short-term framework is frequently disproportionate to its actual strategic significance, because the short-term framework has no context in which to place the setback other than as a terminal evaluation of the current attempt. Strategic thinkers see setbacks as part of a longer arc, not through forced positivity or the performance of resilience, but through a genuine understanding that the arc is long enough to absorb them, that what appears to be a significant reversal in the present moment is frequently a minor correction in the trajectory of something being built over years. They adjust without overreacting. They extract what the setback reveals about the approach, the timing, the conditions, or the assumptions that turned out to be wrong, without collapsing the entire framework around the single data point. They maintain direction while modifying tactics, which is the opposite of what short-term thinking produces. Abandon direction at the first sign of significant resistance. This resilience is not personality. It is perspective, and perspective is produced by the consistent, practiced expansion of the time horizon within which decisions are evaluated. Before any decision of genuine consequence, strategic thinkers apply a single quiet test. Will this still make sense later? Not later as in next week. Later as in when the emotion that is currently influencing the evaluation has cleared, when the pressure that is currently generating urgency has resolved, when the full downstream consequences of this decision have had time to develop. If the answer is clearly yes, this decision, stripped of its current emotional context, still points in the right direction. Proceed. If the answer is unclear, waiting is almost always the strongest available move. Because the decisions that don't survive this test, the ones that feel completely justified right now and look completely different from 6 months out, are exactly the decisions that short-term thinking produces. Taken at peak pressure, with maximum emotional load, in the minimum time available for genuine evaluation. The long game is not about sacrificing the present for the future. It is about refusing to sacrifice the future for a present moment that will pass regardless of what you do. When you think long while others chase short-term wins, you stop competing on speed and start competing on direction. Direction, sustained with patience and discipline, always outperforms urgency. Not immediately. That's the point. In the next chapter, you'll learn the discipline that protects the long game from its most consistent internal threat, the compulsion to engage with everything that demands attention. Strategic detachment is not indifference. It is the practiced, deliberate choice of where your energy goes and, just as critically, where it doesn't. In a world designed to consume your attention, Choosing what not to engage with is among the most powerful strategic decisions available. Chapter 6: Strategic Detachment. Not everything deserves your energy. There is a version of engagement that looks like commitment and functions like self-destruction. It is the state most high-functioning, genuinely capable people find themselves in at the point of their greatest exhaustion, not because they have been lazy, not because they have been careless, but because they have been responding to everything with full attention, at full cost, without ever applying the single most important filter available to someone who wants to operate at the level this book is building toward. The filter is this: does this actually affect my direction, or is it just demanding my attention? Those are not the same thing. And the failure to distinguish between them, the automatic, culturally reinforced assumption that everything that arrives with sufficient urgency or emotional charge deserves a full, engaged, effortful response, is responsible for more strategic failure than poor judgment, bad timing, and insufficient preparation combined. Because a person operating at partial capacity, attention divided, energy depleted, focus scattered across 20 simultaneous engagements of varying strategic relevance, is not making their best decisions in any of them. They are making depleted decisions everywhere. And depleted decisions, accumulated over time, produce lives that look busy and feel exhausting and somehow never quite build the position they were pointed at. Strategic detachment is the correction, not withdrawal, not coldness, not the performance of not caring in an attempt to appear above the noise. The practiced, deliberate, repeatedly applied discipline of choosing where your energy goes and protecting that choice from everything that demands it without deserving it. Detachment begins with a recognition that most people resist because it runs against the way responsiveness has been framed as virtue. Reacting to everything gives everything power over you. When you feel obligated to respond to every comment, explain yourself to every skeptic, defend every decision to everyone who questions it, engage every conflict that presents itself for engagement, you are not demonstrating thoroughness or commitment. You are demonstrating that your attention is available to whoever claims it first, regardless of whether their claim is legitimate. The person who responds to everything is predictable in the most strategically costly way. Their attention can be captured. Their energy can be directed. Their focus can be pulled from high-value activities toward low-value exchanges simply by generating sufficient noise, pressure, or apparent urgency. Strategic thinkers guard against this not through aggression or explicit refusal, but through a quiet internal process that happens before engagement rather than after. The rapid, practiced evaluation of whether this situation actually warrants the resources it is requesting. Most situations do not. Most situations that feel urgent are urgent primarily because emotion is involved, because something has been said that touches a sensitive point, because something has been implied that the ego wants to correct, because the silence of non-response feels like concession to someone who hasn't yet understood that the non-response was the response. Strategic thinkers allow many things to exist without becoming involved in them, not because they are indifferent, because they understand that engagement is a resource, and resources allocated to the wrong situations are unavailable for the right ones. The energy question is the core of this chapter and deserves its fullest examination. Attention is finite, not metaphorically, operationally. The human capacity for focused, high-quality cognitive engagement has a daily limit that is not expandable by will or by motivation. It depletes with use. It recovers with rest. And the rate of depletion is determined not just by the magnitude of what is engaged with, but by the number of things engaged with. Because each engagement, regardless of its individual scale, draws from the same pool. This means that the strategic management of attention, the deliberate choice of what receives engagement and what does not, is not a secondary concern. It is the primary constraint on the quality of every decision made, every relationship maintained, every long-term objective pursued. Strategic thinkers understand that every unnecessary engagement costs something. The argument that didn't need to happen depleted resources that were needed for the decision that came 2 hours later. The explanation offered to someone who wasn't genuinely seeking understanding consumed focus that the actual problem required. The conflict fed by continued engagement that would have resolved itself through strategic non-participation burned energy that was borrowed from the next day's capacity. The accumulation of these costs, invisible in any single instance, is the mechanism through which busy people with genuine capability consistently underperform what their talent should produce. You cannot think strategically at low capacity. The observational quality required by Chapter 1, the emotional regulation required by Chapter 2, the situational reading required by Chapter 3, the communication restraint required by Chapter 4, the long-term perspective required by Chapter 5, all of these require cognitive and emotional resources that are not available in a depleted system. Strategic detachment is not a separate discipline. It is the practice that protects every other discipline from the corrosion of continuous, indiscriminate engagement. Most conflicts continue only because someone keeps feeding them. This is one of the most useful observations a strategic thinker can internalize, because it reframes the decision to disengage from a conflict as active strategy rather than passive avoidance. Arguments escalate because both parties feel the need to be heard, acknowledged, and ultimately validated. Each response to a provocation generates a counter-response. Each counter-response re-energizes the original position. The conflict sustains itself through mutual engagement. Each party's continued investment giving the other party justification for their own continued investment. Strategic thinkers end this loop not through confrontation, but through withdrawal of fuel. They step back from the exchange. They allow their silence to interrupt the cycle. They remove the emotional investment that was keeping the conflict alive and allow it to run out of the energy it needs to sustain itself. Without resistance, most conflicts lose momentum. The argument that required a combatant becomes a monologue. The position that demanded engagement receives none and loses the energy to sustain its own assertion. Situations that appeared to require resolution frequently resolve themselves when deprived of the fuel that was actually maintaining them. This is not avoidance. It is the recognition that participation in a conflict is a choice, and that withdrawing participation is frequently the most powerful strategic decision available. Strategic thinkers ask one question before engaging any conflict. If I don't respond, what actually happens? In the majority of cases, the honest answer is less than the emotional urgency of the moment is suggesting. The specific energy drain that deserves its own examination is the need to be understood. This is perhaps the most quietly expensive compulsion available to an intelligent, capable person. The need to have your intentions correctly interpreted, to have your decisions understood in the context you made them, to correct misunderstandings before they calcify into incorrect impressions, to ensure that the story others are telling about you matches the story you would tell about yourself. The drive behind this need is legitimate. Misrepresentation has real consequences. Incorrect impressions do shape how people respond to you. The desire to be accurately perceived is not irrational. But the compulsion to ensure accurate perception, the exhausting, continuous project of managing how every person in your environment understands you, consumes resources far out of proportion to what it produces. Strategic thinkers accept that some people will misunderstand them, misrepresent them, or form incorrect impressions of their intentions. They accept this not because they are indifferent to their reputation, but because they understand the difference between what can be managed and what cannot. Understanding cannot be forced. Explanation offered to someone who has decided not to understand you is energy deposited into a closed account. It will produce no returns. Correction offered to someone whose impression is fixed will often strengthen the impression by confirming that you are affected by it. Strategic thinkers let incorrect impressions stand when clarification would not change the outcome. They direct the resources saved toward the relationships and situations where genuine understanding is both possible and consequential. They are willing to be misunderstood today in service of results that will, over time, reframe the impression without requiring a single word of explanation. There is a three-question filter that strategic thinkers apply before engaging anything that is requesting their attention and energy. The first question, does this affect my direction? Not whether it is interesting, important in the abstract, emotionally activating, or legitimately deserving of someone's attention. Whether it affects the specific direction this particular person is building. If the honest answer is no, if this situation, fully engaged with and resolved, would leave the direction unchanged, the case for full engagement is already weak. The second question, am I the right person to engage with this? Many situations that present themselves as requiring your involvement do not actually require your involvement. They require someone's involvement, and the social, professional, or relational proximity that caused them to arrive at your attention does not automatically make you the correct or most effective respondent. Strategic thinkers are clear about jurisdiction. They engage what is genuinely theirs to engage and decline to absorb problems that belong elsewhere. The third question, what does engagement cost versus what does it produce? Not in the abstract. In specific resources, time, attention, emotional energy, focus, measured against the concrete value of the most favorable possible outcome of full engagement. If the cost exceeds the return at maximum upside, non-engagement is not avoidance. It is mathematics. These three questions, applied consistently, do not eliminate engagement. They purify it. They ensure that when you do engage, with full attention, genuine investment, and the complete resources of a mind operating at capacity, the engagement is in a situation that deserves what it is receiving. Strategic detachment also creates a secondary advantage that operates quietly over time. When you are not constantly engaged with everything, you are available for the things that genuinely matter. The conversation that requires your fullest attention arrives to a mind that has it. The decision that requires your best judgment finds you at capacity rather than depleted. The relationship that deserves your genuine presence receives it from someone who is actually there, rather than from someone physically present and cognitively absent, divided across the residue of 20 lower-stakes engagements that are still running in the background. Presence, genuine, full, undivided presence, is among the rarest things one human being can offer another. It is also among the most powerful. Strategic thinkers understand that the ability to be fully present is not just an interpersonal quality. It is a strategic resource, and it is protected by the discipline of not spending it indiscriminately. Detachment is not the absence of caring. It is the presence of discernment. The strategic thinker who declines to engage every conflict, explain themselves to every skeptic, respond to every provocation, and absorb every problem that drifts into their vicinity is not cold. They are protected and protecting the energy that genuine engagement requires, protecting the direction that continuous distraction erodes, protecting the clarity that indiscriminate involvement clouds. In a world that has engineered itself almost perfectly for the capture of human attention, where every platform, every notification, every social dynamic is calibrated to generate the sense of urgency that demands response, the discipline of strategic detachment is not a luxury. It is the prerequisite for operating at the level the rest of this book describes. Guard your energy. Not because the world doesn't matter, because the parts of it that genuinely do deserve everything you have. In the next chapter, you'll discover why patience is not the passive quality it is almost universally mistaken for. It is an active, precise, strategically deployed form of leverage. In a world that rewards speed and punishes delay, the person who understands how to wait, and more specifically, when waiting is the dominant strategic position, holds an advantage that force, speed, and aggression cannot replicate. Patience is not delay. It is dominance over impulse. And that dominance is the subject of Chapter 7. Chapter 7, Patience is a Weapon. Speed is celebrated almost everywhere you look. The fast response, the quick decision, the immediate action that signals competence, confidence, and control. Culture rewards the person who moves first, who seizes the opening before it closes, who answers before the question has fully settled, who acts while others are still assessing. Speed feels like power. Speed looks like capability. Speed, in most professional and social environments, is treated as a proxy for intelligence. This makes patience one of the most consistently underestimated strategic advantages available. Because in a world full of people competing on speed, the person who has developed the genuine capacity to wait, not from indecision, not from fear, not from the paralysis of someone who doesn't know what to do, but from the clear-eyed strategic understanding that the moment has not yet arrived, operates from a position that urgency cannot reach and force cannot replicate. Patience is not the absence of strategy. It is strategy in its most disciplined form. It is the active, deliberate, continuously maintained choice to hold position until the conditions align, to refuse the pressure to move before movement serves the direction, to trust that time, allowed to operate, will produce information and advantage that premature action would have prevented. In every situation where patience and urgency compete, patience holds a structural advantage that most people never access because it requires tolerating exactly the kind of discomfort that the nervous system is most aggressively designed to eliminate. Understanding that advantage, precisely, operationally, without romanticizing the quality into something passive, is what this chapter is built to produce. Urgency is the primary weapon deployed against strategic position. Not always consciously, not always maliciously, but consistently, because urgency works. It works because the human nervous system is not designed to distinguish between genuine time pressure and manufactured time pressure. It registers both as threat. It responds to both by generating the impulse to act immediately, to resolve the uncertainty, to eliminate the discomfort of a situation that is presenting itself as requiring resolution now. Strategic thinkers develop the capacity to examine urgency before responding to it. The question is never whether the urgency feels real. It always feels real. The question is whether it is structurally real, whether the deadline is actual or constructed, whether the window is genuinely closing or being framed as closing to produce movement that benefits the party applying the pressure, whether waiting, past the point where the pressure is most intense, would actually cost what the urgency implies it would cost. In a majority of cases, the honest examination reveals that the urgency is real primarily as an emotional experience. The actual situation has more flexibility than the pressure suggests. The window is wider than it is being presented. The cost of waiting is lower than the cost of moving prematurely under conditions that haven't yet fully revealed themselves. Strategic thinkers let urgency reveal what it is protecting. They observe where the pressure is coming from, what it is trying to produce, and who benefits from the movement it is designed to generate. And they hold position past the point of discomfort, not indefinitely, but long enough for the actual structure of the situation to become visible beneath the emotional charge of the manufactured emergency. This holding is not passive. It is among the most active, demanding, continuously effortful things a strategic thinker does. Because the pull toward premature action is constant, physiologically generated, and culturally reinforced. Resisting it requires the full application of everything this book has built: the observational capacity to see what is happening, the emotional regulation to tolerate the discomfort without acting from it, the situational reading to assess whether the urgency is structural or performed, the long-term orientation to value the position that patience protects over the relief that premature action would provide. The person who can wait often controls the direction of events. This is the operational mechanism of patience as leverage, and it operates through a dynamic that most people experience regularly without ever naming it clearly enough to use deliberately. When two parties are engaged in any situation requiring resolution, a negotiation, a conflict, a decision, a relationship dynamic, the party who needs resolution sooner is structurally weaker. not because they are less capable or less intelligent, but because their timeline is constrained in a way that the other party's is not. They have less room to maneuver. They cannot afford to wait for better conditions. They must accept what is available now because what is available later is not accessible to them. The party that can wait has options the constrained party does not. They can allow the situation to develop further. They can let conditions improve. They can observe more before committing. They can maintain the flexibility that comes from not being bound to a timeline that someone else controls. This asymmetry, visible in every negotiation, every conflict, every situation where two parties have different relationships with time, means that patience is not just a personal quality. It is a strategic position, and cultivating it deliberately, building the genuine capacity to tolerate uncertainty and sustain pressure without premature resolution, is not just character development. It is the construction of leverage. Patience also functions as a filter for authenticity. Most people, when given sufficient time without pressure, reveal exactly who they are and what they actually want. Sustained patience, the kind that refuses to rush a situation toward premature resolution, creates the conditions under which this revelation happens. People who are performing patience while waiting for the right moment to apply pressure will eventually apply it. People whose positions were more flexible than they presented them will eventually show the flexibility. People whose urgency was genuine will eventually make that visible in ways that distinguish it from manufactured pressure. The strategic thinker who waits is not idle. They are observing, gathering the information that only time produces, allowing the situation to reveal itself at the depth that rushed engagement would have prevented. This is patience as intelligence gathering, not the absence of activity, but a specific, deliberate form of information collection that requires the discipline to remain still while everything in the environment is pushing toward movement. Time, in this application, is not a neutral variable. It is an ally available to the person with the capacity to use it. Most mistakes are not caused by lack of ability. They are caused by premature action. The decision made before the situation had revealed enough. The commitment entered before the terms were fully understood. The position stated before the full context was clear. The bridge burned in a moment when the emotion was high enough to make the burning feel justified and the relationship stable enough to make the cost seem theoretical. Premature action and reactive action are not identical, but they share the same root cause. Both are produced by the inability to tolerate the gap between the moment when action feels necessary and the moment when action is strategically correct. That gap is where patience lives. Strategic thinkers have learned, through experience, through the specific and personal education of having paid the cost of premature action enough times to understand what it actually costs, that the gap is not the enemy. The gap is the protection. The additional information that arrives in the gap, the changed conditions that develop in the gap, the clarity that emerges in the gap when the emotional charge of the initial moment has dissipated and the actual structure of the situation becomes visible. The improved terms that become available in the gap when the other party's urgency, sustained without the relief of your premature movement, begins to modify their position. All of this is produced by patience. None of it is available to premature action, which arrives before the gap has done its work. There is a version of patience that looks like patience and is actually fear. This distinction matters because conflating them produces either false confidence, mistaking avoidance for strategy, or false self-criticism, attacking genuine strategic restraint as cowardice. Fear-based waiting is characterized by the absence of a clear strategic reason for holding position. It is waiting because movement feels dangerous, because commitment feels exposing, because the uncertainty of the gap is being tolerated not as a productive interval, but as a refuge from the requirement to decide. Strategic patience is characterized by the presence of a clear reason. It knows what it is waiting for, what information, what condition, what development, and it is oriented toward that clarity while holding position. It is active, not passive, directed, not hiding. The diagnostic question is, Do I know what I am waiting for? If the answer is yes, if there is a specific condition whose arrival would change the calculation, a specific piece of information whose absence makes commitment premature, the waiting is strategic. If the answer is no, if the waiting is simply the avoidance of commitment without a clear sense of what development would justify movement, it is likely fear dressed in the language of strategy. Strategic thinkers are honest about this distinction in their own behavior. They do not allow the vocabulary of patience to protect avoidance from examination. Patience, practiced over time, changes the quality of everything it touches. The communication of someone who has developed genuine patience is fundamentally different from the communication of someone operating under urgency. The decisions are different. The relationships are different. The impression left on every environment entered is different, because patience is visible in the specific way that its absence is visible, and what it communicates is a form of confidence that urgency can never replicate. The person who is not rushed cannot be hurried. The person who is not urgency-driven cannot be pressure manipulated into premature positions. The person who can afford to wait, genuinely, not performatively, holds a form of composure that the most practiced negotiator reads immediately as real leverage. Not because patience announces itself, because it doesn't need to. The practice of building patience is specific. It begins with the smallest applications, the pause before the reply, the breath before the response, the deliberate decision to let the next 24 hours develop before committing to a direction on anything that can wait 24 hours. These small applications build the tolerance for larger ones, the capacity to hold position in a negotiation that is designed to make waiting uncomfortable, the ability to sustain a strategic silence in a conflict that is applying pressure for engagement. The willingness to allow a situation to develop past the point where the urgency is loudest into the clearer ground on the other side. Patience is trained the same way every other discipline in this book is trained, through repeated application in progressively more demanding situations, each successful instance of restraint strengthening the capacity for the next one, the tolerance for discomfort increasing with exposure rather than decreasing. You do not develop patience by waiting when it is easy. You develop it by waiting when it is hard, when the pressure is real, when the urgency feels genuine, when every signal in the environment is pushing toward movement. And you hold. Not forever, not passively, with clear awareness of what you are waiting for and genuine confidence that the position being protected is worth the cost of protecting it. Because in every situation where patience and urgency compete, patience wins longer. In the final chapter, you'll learn why the quietest victories are the most durable ones, and why the strategic thinker who has built the disciplines of this book doesn't need to announce what has been built. The results speak. The trajectory speaks. The calm speaks. Chapter 8 is about becoming the person whose presence communicates everything the words no longer need to say, and why winning without noise is not just a strategic preference, but the natural expression of someone who has fully internalized everything that came before it. Chapter 8. Win quietly. Let results speak. There is a specific kind of person who makes everyone in a room slightly more aware of themselves. Not through dominance, not through volume or aggression or the performance of authority, through something quieter and considerably more unsettling to anyone operating from a position of insecurity, the composed, unhurried, completely unannounced presence of someone who clearly has nothing to prove. You have met this person. You remember them, not because they said the most or moved the fastest or made the strongest case for their own significance, because they didn't need to, because there was something in the quality of their stillness, in the absence of the continuous low-level performance that most people run as a background process in every social and professional environment, that communicated more than anything they actually said. That quality is not a personality type. It is not a gift distributed unevenly at birth to the naturally confident and withheld from everyone else. It is the end state of the disciplines this book has been building. When observation has become natural, when emotional control has become practiced, when situational reading is internalized, when communication has been stripped of everything that doesn't serve the moment, when the long game has become the default orientation, when energy is protected through strategic detachment, when patience has been trained past the point where urgency can rush it. The person on the other side of all that work does not need to announce themselves. They have become the announcement. Most people operate under a fundamental misunderstanding about the relationship between visibility and progress. The assumption is that attention confirms movement, that if people are noticing, things are working. That visibility, acknowledgement, recognition, the external confirmation that what is being built is being seen, is evidence that the direction is correct. This assumption is expensive in two specific ways. The first is that it makes progress conditional on perception. When external confirmation is required to sustain internal direction, the absence of that confirmation becomes destabilizing. Every quiet period, every stretch of consistent execution that hasn't yet produced visible results, generates doubt that interrupts the consistency. The builder stops building to check whether anyone has noticed the building. The checking interrupts the building. The interruption delays the results. The delay produces more doubt. The cycle is self-reinforcing and reliably destructive. The second is that visibility invites interference. This is the less obvious and more strategically significant cost. When you announce what you are building, when you speak about the direction, broadcast the progress, perform the journey publicly, you invite the full range of responses that human beings generate when they encounter someone else's aspiration. Some of those responses are supportive. Many of them are not. And even the supportive ones carry a cost that the unsupported building doesn't. They make what you are building subject to the opinions of people who have no stake in its success and no genuine understanding of the work involved in achieving it. Strategic thinkers build quietly because quiet building is protected building. Not from legitimate feedback, which is sought deliberately from people with relevant knowledge, in contexts where honest input serves the development. From the diffuse, continuous, ambient interference of operating publicly before the foundation is solid enough to withstand the weight of exposure. Underestimation is an asset. This requires saying directly because it runs against every instinct the ego generates in the direction of being correctly perceived, appropriately credited, and accurately evaluated. When people underestimate you, when they form an impression of your capability, ambition, or knowledge that falls below the actual level, they make decisions based on that incorrect impression. They don't guard against what they don't see coming. They don't prepare defenses against a capability they haven't registered. They don't compete with a threat they haven't identified. Strategic thinkers allow this to happen. They do not correct the low impression when leaving it uncorrected serves them. They do not perform capability in situations where the performance would eliminate an advantage that the underestimation provides. This is not deception. It is the deliberate management of information about your own position. The same discipline applied in Chapter 4 to verbal communication, applied here to the broader question of how much of your actual capability is visible at any given time. The person who is never underestimated has no element of surprise available. They are always engaged with on the basis of their known capacity, which means they are always defended against, always anticipated, always met by a level of preparation calibrated to what others already know they can do. The person who operates below the assessed ceiling, who does more than expected, who arrives further along than the last visible checkpoint suggested, who produces results that exceed the level that the impression would predict, generates a form of impact that the fully visible operator never can. Let expectations be low. Meet them with reality. The gap between those two things is where influence is built. Results, over time, produce a form of credibility that no amount of explanation or self-promotion can replicate. This is the principle that makes quiet execution the most durable long-term strategy available. Not because noise doesn't work in the short term, it often does, but because noise-based credibility is perpetually dependent on continued noise. The moment the performance stops, the credibility it produced begins to erode. It was built on presentation rather than substance, and presentation requires continuous maintenance. Results-based credibility is self-sustaining. Each result adds to a foundation that exists independently of whether it is being narrated. The track record speaks without requiring a speaker. The pattern of consistent delivery creates an impression that is more resistant to challenge than anything stated, because it is not based on what someone has said about themselves, but on what they have demonstrably done. Strategic thinkers invest in results rather than in the perception of results. They understand that the perception will follow the results, that it always does, given sufficient time, and that attempting to manufacture the perception before the results are there is not only inefficient but counterproductive. It sets expectations that the current stage cannot meet and creates the specific credibility damage of appearing to have promised more than was delivered. Do the work. Completely, consistently, without announcement. Let the work accumulate into a body of evidence that makes the case on its own behalf. This requires patience, the patience of Chapter 7, applied to the timeline of reputation rather than the timeline of a single situation. It requires the long-term orientation of Chapter 5, extended to the question of how credibility is built. It requires the detachment of Chapter 6, strong enough to resist the pull toward premature visibility. Everything in this book connects here. The final discipline is the integration of all the previous ones. Quiet confidence is not the absence of certainty. It is certainty that doesn't require external confirmation. The difference is specific and operational. Confidence that depends on external confirmation, on acknowledgement, approval, recognition, or the absence of challenge, is structurally fragile. It is only as stable as the most recent input it received. Every silence becomes ambiguous. Every failure to acknowledge becomes a potential negative signal. Every challenge to the position becomes a threat to the foundation rather than simply a point of disagreement. Confidence that doesn't require external confirmation is built from a different material. From the accumulated experience of having observed accurately, regulated consistently, read situations correctly, communicated deliberately, built long-term, protected energy strategically, and waited with discipline past the point where urgency was applying maximum pressure. Not from being told you're capable. From having demonstrated it to yourself, repeatedly, privately, in the unglamorous daily execution of disciplines that nobody else was watching. This is the confidence that reads as authority in a room. Not because it is performed for the room, but because it has nothing to perform. It is simply what remains when the need for external validation has been replaced by the accumulated internal evidence of consistent self-governance. The room responds to it because the room is full of people whose confidence is dependent and who recognize, at a level below conscious analysis, the specific quality of confidence that is not. There is one final thing that quiet winning produces that is worth naming explicitly. Freedom. The freedom of someone who is not managing appearances, who is not tracking how they are being perceived or calculating what the current room requires them to perform, who is not expending the continuous, exhausting background energy of someone whose sense of standing is perpetually dependent on the next confirmation. That freedom is visible. It is the specific quality that makes certain people magnetic without trying, that makes others want to be in their vicinity, to seek their counsel, to extend trust before it has been explicitly earned. Not because they are performing magnetic, because they are free. And freedom, in an environment full of people who are managing themselves against the continuous pressure of external evaluation, is genuinely rare. Strategic thinkers arrive at this freedom through the exact path this book has described. Not through a single insight or a single decision, but through the accumulated, practiced, repeatedly applied disciplines that gradually shift the source of stability from external to internal, until the external signals are received as information rather than instruction, and the direction is set from the inside rather than calibrated by whatever the outside is currently rewarding. This is where the architecture is complete. Observation without reaction, emotional control without suppression, situational intelligence without rigidity. Communication that serves rather than performs. Long-term orientation that endures short-term discomfort. Energy protected through strategic discernment. Patience deployed as leverage. Results built quietly and allowed to speak. 8 disciplines. 1 direction. The direction is inward, toward the development of a mind that is genuinely self-governing, that moves through complex environments with clarity and composure, that produces results without requiring the world's attention to sustain its confidence. You do not need to be the loudest person in any room. You do not need to be first. You do not need to announce what you are building, defend what you have done, or perform what you are capable of. You need to be consistent. Consistent in observation. Consistent in regulation. Consistent in deliberate, patient, quietly executed movement toward the direction that matters. The world will notice. Not because you made it notice. Because consistency, over time, is impossible to ignore. Win quietly. Build consistently. Let the work speak. That is the quiet advantage, and it belongs entirely to those who are willing to develop it, one unglamorous, unannounced, completely deliberate day at a time. The work is done. The architecture is complete. Everything that follows is application. Chapter 9. Build the life nobody sees coming. Everything in this book has been building toward a single moment. Not a dramatic one, not a visible one, not the kind that gets announced or celebrated or recognized by the people around you in real time. The moment when the disciplines stop being disciplines. When observation is no longer something you remind yourself to do. It is simply how you move through rooms. When emotional regulation is no longer a practice applied under pressure, it is the default state you return to automatically when pressure attempts to move you away from it. When situational reading is no longer a deliberate framework consciously deployed, it is the background process running continuously beneath every exchange, quietly mapping the actual structure of every environment you enter. The moment when the architecture becomes the person. That moment does not arrive through a single insight or a single decision. It does not arrive through motivation or inspiration or the renewed commitment that follows a particularly resonant chapter in a book about strategic thinking. It arrives through repetition, through the accumulation of 1,000 unglamorous daily applications of the same 8 disciplines, each one adding an almost imperceptible layer to a foundation that is being built below the level of visibility and above the level of luck. Most people will never reach that moment, not because they lack the capacity, because they will encounter the gap between understanding and application, the gap where every useful idea and every useful book eventually lands, and they will allow the gap to remain a gap. This chapter exists to close it. The 8 disciplines of this book do not operate independently. This is the understanding that separates people who have read about strategic thinking from people who actually think strategically. The disciplines are not a list of separate skills to be developed in isolation, applied situationally, and returned to their individual compartments when the immediate need has passed. They are a system, each one creating the conditions that make the next one possible, each one drawing from and reinforcing every other one, each one, in isolation, producing a fraction of what it produces when the full architecture is operational. Observation, the first chapter, the first discipline, is not fully accessible without emotional regulation. A mind flooded with unregulated emotion cannot observe accurately. It is too occupied with managing its own internal state to attend fully to the external environment. The observation that strategic thinking requires, quiet, thorough, genuinely detached from the ego's need to immediately interpret everything in relation to itself, is only available to a regulated nervous system. Emotional regulation, in turn, is deepened by observation. The person who has developed the habit of watching situations before entering them has more time between stimulus and response, more of the gap that Chapter 2 identified as the location of genuine choice. Observation creates the space that regulation requires. Situational reading builds on both. It requires the attentional quality that observation develops and the emotional stability that regulation provides. Without observation, situational reading produces incomplete maps. Without emotional regulation, it produces contaminated ones, filtered through the distortions of unexamined personal feeling rather than through the clarity of genuine environmental assessment. Communication restraint, speaking less and meaning more, is the natural expression of all three operating simultaneously. The person who is genuinely observing, genuinely regulated, and genuinely reading the situation with accuracy does not need to speak often. They know what is actually happening. They are not producing words to manage their internal state, and they understand the moment well enough to know when silence serves better than sound. Long-term thinking is made possible by the combination of emotional regulation and communication restraint. The person who is not being rushed by unregulated emotion and is not committing prematurely through impulsive speech has the space, the genuine, structural, daily space, to evaluate decisions against a longer horizon than the pressure of the immediate moment allows. Strategic detachment is the practical application of long-term thinking to the question of daily attention. When direction is clear and the time horizon is extended, the question of which engagements deserve energy and which do not becomes answerable in a way that it never is for someone operating entirely in the present moment under continuous pressure. Patience draws from all of the above. It is impossible to sustain without emotional regulation. It is directionless without long-term thinking. It is indistinguishable from avoidance without the situational reading that knows what it is waiting for. It is rendered unnecessary by the communication restraint that prevents premature commitment in the first place. And quiet confidence, winning without announcement, building without broadcasting, letting results speak, is not a discipline at all. It is what happens when the other seven are working. This integration does not appear all at once. It develops in stages that are worth naming because recognizing them, knowing where you are in the progression, prevents the specific discouragement that comes from applying new disciplines and finding them imperfect in early execution. The first stage is awareness. You know the disciplines exist. You understand their logic. You can describe them clearly. But in the moment, in the actual, real-time pressure of a situation that is requesting your immediate reaction, they are not yet available. You see what happened after the fact. You recognize the observation you didn't make, the regulation you didn't sustain, the patience you didn't hold. The understanding arrives in retrospect. This stage is not failure. It is the beginning of the second stage. The second stage is delay. The disciplines are beginning to operate, but slowly. You react and then catch yourself. You speak and then hear what you said and recognize that silence would have served better. You commit prematurely and then notice, in the days that follow, what additional information the patience you didn't sustain would have provided. The gap is closing, not closed, closing. The third stage is real-time application. The pause before position becomes available in the moment rather than only in retrospect. The emotional signal is noticed before it becomes a statement. The situation is read before the position is committed. The silence is held past the point of discomfort. The long view is accessed while the short-term pressure is still active. This stage feels like the arrival. It is not. The fourth stage is integration, the point at which deliberate application gives way to natural expression, where the disciplines are not consulted but embodied, where the strategic posture is not maintained by effort but produced by character. Most people who commit to this work reach the third stage. The fourth stage belongs to those who continue past the point where the third stage's results make continuation feel optional. Continue past that point. The life nobody sees coming is not a dramatic outcome. It is not the sudden arrival of a visible, publicly acknowledged success that appears to emerge from nowhere. That framing belongs to the outside perspective, to the people who were not watching the unglamorous daily execution that produced the outcome, and who therefore experience it as surprising. From the inside, it is anything but surprising. From the inside, it is the logical, expected, entirely predictable result of the compounding that Chapter 5 described applied over the time horizon that the short-term thinker cannot see from their current position. The life that seems to appear suddenly from the outside was being built continuously on the inside, through every application of observation that gathered information others gave away, through every instance of regulation that protected a decision from emotion, through every situational read that prevented a good move in the wrong conditions, through every deliberate silence that accumulated credibility, through every patient holding of position that preserved leverage that urgency would have surrendered, through every detached non-engagement that conserved the energy that genuine engagement requires. None of those moments were visible. All of them were consequential. The life nobody sees coming is built in the moments nobody sees. There is one more thing that belongs in this chapter, stated plainly because softening it would reduce its usefulness. The people around you will not always understand what you are doing. When you observe instead of react, some will read it as disengagement. When you regulate instead of express, some will read it as coldness. When you read the situation instead of immediately participating in it, some will read it as hesitation. When you speak less, some will read it as having nothing to say. When you decline engagements that don't serve your direction, some will read it as arrogance. When you wait past the point where they would have moved, some will read it as fear. They are reading from a framework that this book has been systematically dismantling. Their readings are not your responsibility to correct. The strategic thinker who pauses to explain their strategic posture to every person who misreads it has failed to apply the most fundamental principle in the book. Explanation offered to people who aren't seeking genuine understanding is energy deposited into a closed account. The misreading will resolve itself through results, through time, through the accumulated evidence of a direction that eventually becomes impossible to misinterpret. Until then, the posture is maintained. The direction is held. The work continues. What other people see, in the present, is their business. What you are building, over time, is yours. The architecture is complete. 8 disciplines, 1 system, 1 direction. Everything that remains is execution, the daily, unglamorous, completely unannounced application of a way of moving through the world that produces, over time, outcomes that the reactive mind cannot reach from its current position. Not because the reactive mind lacks intelligence, because it lacks stillness. And stillness, as this entire book has been demonstrating, is the rarest and most powerful competitive advantage available to anyone willing to develop it. The game is not won by the fastest. It is won by the most consistent, the most deliberate, the most still. 1 chapter remains, not to add new disciplines, the architecture is complete, but to deliver what every framework eventually requires, the bridge between understanding and execution. Chapter 10 is the closing manifesto, the final provocation for everyone who has read this far and is now standing at the edge of the gap between knowing and doing. The quiet advantage is real. The only question remaining is whether you will build it. Chapter 10, the calm that changes everything. You have read 9 chapters about strategic thinking. You understand observation. You understand emotional regulation. You understand situational reading, communication restraint, long-term orientation, strategic detachment, patience as leverage, quiet execution, and the integrated architecture that connects all 8 into a single coherent system. You understand it well enough to explain it, well enough to recognize it when you see it operating in someone else, well enough to identify, in retrospect, every recent situation where applying it would have produced a better outcome than the reaction you actually delivered. And that understanding, sitting exactly where it is right now, complete, clear, and entirely unexecuted, is worth precisely nothing. This is not a criticism. It is a mechanical fact about the relationship between knowledge and result that applies to every useful idea ever encountered by every capable person who encountered it, and then returned to the existing patterns of their life. Information without application is not neutral. It is specifically corrosive Because the mind that has been shown a better way and chosen not to take it cannot return to the innocent ignorance of someone who never saw the path. It now carries the additional weight of knowing. Every reactive moment, every premature commitment, every depleted decision made from the unmanaged urgency that this book has mapped in full detail, all of it now occurs in the presence of the knowledge that it could have gone differently. That presence, unresolved, compounds. The gap between knowing and doing is not a resting place. It is a cost that accumulates with every day it remains a gap. The 30-day protocol is not a program. It is a single commitment applied once in one direction for 30 consecutive days, specific enough to be executable, demanding enough to be meaningful, and long enough for repetition to begin the process of converting deliberate application into natural expression. Here is what it requires. Select one situation, not every situation in your life that would benefit from strategic thinking. 1. The most active one, the relationship, the professional dynamic, the personal challenge, the recurring pattern that is currently costing you the most through reactive, short-term, unregulated engagement. The situation where the gap between your current behavior and the behavior this book describes is widest, most visible, and most expensive. That one. Apply the full architecture to it. Every day, before engaging with this situation in any form, before the conversation, before the decision, before the response, run the complete sequence. Observe before committing. What is actually happening beneath the surface of this situation? What is the real structure of incentives, pressures, and needs operating here that the presented reality is not showing? Regulate before speaking. What is the emotional state currently influencing your read of this situation? Is the story being constructed by that emotional state accurate, or is it the emotion's attempt to justify the action it is already generating? Read before moving. What is the power, pressure, and pace of this situation right now? What is the emotional temperature? Is this the right moment for the action being considered, or is this a good move in the wrong conditions? Speak with purpose or not at all. Does what you are about to say serve the situation, or does it serve the discomfort of silence? What does it reveal? What does it commit you to? Hold the long view. Will this decision still make sense later? Or does it only make sense now because the emotional intensity of the present moment is making it feel more justified than the actual consequences will support? Protect your energy. Does this engagement actually affect your direction, or is it simply demanding attention it hasn't earned? Wait past the urgency. Is the pressure to move now structural or manufactured? What does waiting, past the point of discomfort, into the clearer ground on the other side, produce that premature movement would prevent? Execute without announcement. Build without broadcasting. Hold position without explaining the position to everyone who misreads it. Repeat this for 30 days. Not perfectly, consistently. The clock does not reset for imperfect application. Strategic thinking is not a performance standard that requires flawless execution to produce results. It resets only for the complete abandonment of the framework, for the decision to return to reactive, unregulated, short-term default mode and remain there. Imperfect application every day produces results. Perfect application twice a week produces nothing. Consistency outperforms intensity. The chapter on long-term thinking said this. Here is where it costs something to believe it. The calm that changes everything is not a feeling. Most people imagine that arriving at genuine strategic composure, at the quiet confidence that this book has been describing, will feel different from the inside, that there will be a recognizable internal shift, a sense of settled certainty, a felt experience of having arrived at something. It does not feel like that. From the inside, it feels like ordinary days where you made slightly better choices than the day before, where the pause was a little more natural, where the silence held a little longer before discomfort pulled you toward filling it, where the emotional signal was noticed a little earlier in the sequence, where the decision was evaluated against a slightly longer horizon. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible, nothing that announces itself as the progress it actually is. The shift only becomes apparent in retrospect, in the accumulated difference between where you are now and where the unmodified reactive default would have taken you. In the relationships that didn't fracture because a regulation you practiced held the line. In the positions that didn't collapse because a patience you trained kept them intact past the point where premature action would have surrendered them. In the decisions that still make sense 6 months later because a long-term orientation you developed made the present moment emotional case for the wrong choice resistible. These are quiet victories. They do not produce celebrations. They produce lives that are measurably, substantively, irreversibly different from the lives that the reactive alternative was building. That difference is the calm that changes everything. The world will not slow down to accommodate the pace at which strategic thinking develops. The pressure will be continuous. The urgency will be manufactured without pause. The situations that are designed, consciously or through the simple mechanics of human interaction, to extract reactive, emotionally driven, short-term responses from you will not become less frequent because you have read a book about not providing them. If anything, the early application of these disciplines will generate more pressure, not less. Because the absence of your usual reactive response creates a vacuum that many people will attempt to fill by intensifying the pressure, by escalating the urgency, increasing the emotional charge, or introducing new variables designed to destabilize the composure that your non-reaction communicated. This is expected. It is not failure. It is the system testing whether the new pattern is real or performed. Strategic thinkers hold through the test. Not because holding is easy, because they understand what the test is, and because understanding what something is, mechanically and precisely, removes most of its power to produce the reaction it is designed to produce. This is the final gift of the framework, not immunity to pressure, clarity about pressure, the ability to observe it, name it, and choose a response that serves the direction rather than the discomfort. That clarity, practiced past the point of performance and into the territory of genuine internalization, is what stillness actually is. Not the absence of movement, the presence of choice. Here is what becomes available on the other side of 30 days of consistent application. Not a transformed life, visible and complete. A changed relationship with the present moment, the specific, practiced, increasingly natural ability to be in a situation without being controlled by it, to feel the pressure without becoming the pressure, to observe the urgency without becoming urgent, to receive the provocation without becoming the reaction. That relationship, once established, compounds. Every day of consistent application adds to a foundation that makes the next day's application slightly more natural and slightly less effortful. The disciplines that required conscious deployment in month 1 begin to operate semi-automatically in month 3. The gap between stimulus and response that had to be created manually begins to exist as a default feature of how the mind processes incoming information. The architecture becomes the person. And the person, calm, deliberate, genuinely self-governing, moves through the world with the particular quiet authority of someone who has stopped competing on the terms that most people are competing on. Not faster, not louder, not more aggressive or more dominant or more insistently visible. More still. In a reactive world, stillness is the rarest competitive advantage available. You have spent 10 chapters learning what it is. Now comes the only part that actually matters. When others rush, observe. When others react, wait. When others speak, listen. When others announce, build. When others chase, hold. When others need to win the moment, protect the direction. Do this consistently, in the unglamorous daily execution that nobody is watching and everyone will eventually see the results of, and the life nobody sees coming will arrive with the quiet certainty of something that was always inevitable. Not because the world finally cooperated, because you stopped waiting for it to. The quiet advantage is yours. Build it. End of the quiet advantage. How strategic thinkers observe more, react less, and win without making noise.